I'm Thomas Maleet of Postcards and Podcasts, and I am meeting with Howard Rudge once again at another Anglo-Norman castle, Upton Castle in Pembrokeshire. Hello there, Howard.
Hi, Tom.
Thank you for inviting me to this fantastic location, Upton Castle. As a local historian and I suppose specialist on castles, tell me a bit more about Upton.
Sure. Well, first of all, welcome to this beautiful home. It is, of course, primarily a beautiful home, but it's also a medieval castle. It has an ancient chapel that's even older than the castle, and it has some magnificent gardens and arboretum, woodlands, ancient woodlands, and far more besides. It's a beautiful spot right in the heart of Pembrokeshire, near to the banks of the River Cleddau. But I'm going to start the story by going back to the period when the Normans invaded Wales. They sailed up Milford Haven in 1093 and started building the first wooden castle at Pembroke. But what they very quickly did thereafter was to develop a line of Motte and Bailey castles running across the centre of Pembrokeshire from west to east, starting at Haverfordwest and ending up in Narberth and then cutting back down towards the coast near Carmarthenshire.
Landscape line.
The Landscape line, indeed it is. And then what they were doing was infilling that space with more defensive positions, and Upton stands right at the very heart of Pembrokeshire, that division between the Anglo-Norman speaking south and the Welsh-speaking north. And Upton lies right at the very heart of that system where the rivers are all meeting each other into the Cleddau River and then into the estuary of Milford Haven. And of course, back then, the rivers were the motorways of the medieval period. So most people would be building their houses and defensive positions by the river because that was their source of supply and their source of escape, if need be. And Upton is no different in that respect. So they built a Motte and Bailey castle here. It seems that we've discovered where that Motte and Bailey castle is, but that's got to be, as yet, checked out in more detail. And then, under the lee of that Motte and Bailey castle, they developed the township, which is now called Upton. In fact, the word up means high, and ton is the old name for a settlement. So Upton, a high settlement, because it stands high on some high ground, away from the levels of the water and the River Cleddau below the grounds of the castle.
Sure.
And there's a fabulous amount of history here, going right back to the start of the Norman period, and even, we're not certain about this, a lot more research, but even possibly even before the Normans arrived, there may just have been the suspicion of a Welsh settlement here in the very same spot. Naturally, because it's a beautiful piece of high ground, it's away from the rivers, yet close to the rivers. Why wouldn't you have a settlement here in all this lush, fertile land? But there's no evidence of that as yet.
So, Howard, though this is a wonderfully comfy living room, would we be able to go and see some of the medieval aspects of it, of this building?
Indeed. I am indeed planning to show you some of the features. First of all, if we get the opportunity, we're going to have a look at what was the original great hall of the castle in which the knights and their families would have lived. They would both eat and sleep in the great hall of this magnificent castle. And the chapel, because that's, as I said earlier, is a building that's even more ancient than the castle itself, and there are fascinating history attached to that. But also to mention that that in fact initially was the heart of the community here at Upton before the castle was built. And then further into the grounds we have some beautiful gardens.
Are they medieval?
The gardens? No. They're relatively modern. The walled garden here was built about 1785, and most of the gardens that you see today were in Victorian landscapers who really carved up the landscape and flattened so much of it out to get the beautiful lawns outside. And then there are some modern gardens as well, but there is also an arboretum with some very special trees in it. There's a very famous yew tree here,
I
which is a
noticed
heritage tree, which is a magnificent tree now. And that's at least 800 years old. And then beyond the Arboretum, there is a very ancient woodland called Hood's Wood.
Shall we?
Yes,
Brilliant.
Go and have a look.
So, Howard, now that we're outside and stood against a huge tree, would you please set the scene?
Yes, of course I will. Well, this magnificent tree behind us is a yew tree, and we know that this particular one is at least 800 years old. Now, yew trees are very well known for being planted in the grounds of churches and graveyards. There are strong religious connections with the yew tree, and clearly, as we're only a few yards away from Upton's chapel, this was planted in holy ground. It actually now is situated outside the walls of the castle, but was originally a small tree just near to the castle walls and also to the chapel behind us. So the space we're looking at now was originally the courtyard of the castle, but unfortunately two of the walls are missing on this side, but those two sides are the original medieval castle walls. And I just want you to imagine people relaxing in the security and the safety of that courtyard there. Well, Tom, welcome to the Chapel of Upton. This building is standing here, has stood here for at least 800 years. We think it may even be earlier than the year 1200, but that's to be further reviewed and discussed.
Sure.
It's an ancient chapel, and originally it was just this rectangular building we see here that had a round end to it called an apse.
Yes.
And at some time around about 1350, the apse was removed and the chancel was added. The extension or chancel was added then. But there are a whole number of burials in here, a lot of history in here. For example, this is the effigy of Sir William Malifant, who was the master of Upton, and he died in the year 1362.
Sure.
And in the chancel are the remains of his wife, with her effigy, Margaret, who died much later, about 30 years after her husband.
Why aren't they together?
Well, originally, this was still, when they were married, this was still a church, small church with an apse. Okay.
Yeah.
And because of the position, either Lady Margaret was moved from here into a new chancel, or in fact the chancel was built and she was still perhaps moved from here into that chancel. We just don't know. We can't be absolutely certain. But more research is needed to try and clarify these various questions that still hang in the air about who, what, where and when, which are an awful lot of questions. But we do know, in fact, that the date of his death, we know the date of this chapel is at least no later than 1200, and that is going to be sometime around about 1350 for the addition of the chancel. Okay. Huge amount of history. And this chapel was the centre of the settlement known as Upton, the town on the high ground. And the community would have consisted around this chapel of many wooden houses with thatched roofs, very small and tucked away in a very safe place. There's no doubt that right here, slap bang in the middle of Pembrokeshire, this was probably one of the safest places to be. And by the time the Normans had finished their ring of steel, as I call it, with all their Motte and Bailey castles, it was very safe.
Clearly this is a wonderful wall garden, Howard, and we've just been admiring the wonderful white peacock over
magnificent.
there. Maybe you could give us something about the history of it.
Indeed.
The garden, not the peacock.
Indeed. The wall garden was built in about 1785, so it is an old one. It's a Georgian wall garden, and as you can see, it's made of brick, not stone. But it was the pride and joy of the Tasker family who built this garden. And as you can already see yourself, just acres of magnificent flowers, vegetable patches, orchard. It's a wonderful place. It's quiet, restful, has its greenhouses and the fruit trees growing against the far wall. It is just a magnificent place, and it's been a pride and joy to Upton Castle for the best part of 250 years. And I just wish I had a vegetable garden as big as this one.
Didn't you say there were some other gardens around here, Howard?
There are indeed. There's some beautiful terraces, a rose garden, and of course there's the Arboretum as well. Let's go and have a look, shall we?
Sure. I understand, Howard, that you believe this to be, or it used to be, a gatehouse.
Yes, indeed. It is, I believe, the gatehouse of the original medieval castle. This is it. This is about 1350 right here. Now, this was the main entrance to the castle, but it was guarded by a huge pit here right in front of the house, and then there was a drawbridge which could be lowered down to cover over the gap, and people could walk across the drawbridge into the castle. And we're fairly confident about that because up there are two holes, and those allowed the chains from the winch inside to come down to the drawbridge here. And inside that was a little chamber in which was situated the original winding barrel on which they would turn with spokes, and gradually they would lift up the drawbridge back into position to be closed.
Yes, yes.
So fairly confident from the tower here, across this, to this tower, and indeed to the next tower.
The third one.
All this is the original frontage of the castle around about 1350.
Brilliant. So, Howard, we've moved on from the front door to this area which is adjacent. What is this?
Let me explain. Clearly, they had to have somewhere to live. Now, in the medieval period, they had one great hall, one large room, and they would both dine in there and sleep in there as well.
Yes, yes.
And that's exactly what lies behind these walls here. On this ground floor level, there is a storage area, but up there, the top half is behind these walls, the great hall. Unfortunately, the flooring is not safe, so we can't go inside at the moment. One day I hope to be able to go in and film inside there. But quite simply imagine a room about 35 feet long by about 20 feet wide, very high, hammer beam roof, and a huge fireplace on one of the walls. A very classic medieval fireplace it is too, because I have actually seen it.
Right.
And
on
inside,
the wall? Or?
On the wall, yes, on the wall on this side, in fact.
Sure.
And what you have is just a picture. At one end of the room, you have the top table where obviously the Lord would sit, the Malefants would sit, and a long table running down from that, and the rest of the family members sat along that table, and the servants would bring up the food from the kitchens, which are at the rear of the castle, and serve all the food and wine. And I can promise you the food was excellent, and so was the beer and the cider and the wine. It really had a good time. The food was excellent, the drinks were plentiful, and then of course they were ready for bed. So what they did was, in the very early phases at least, they would have simply moved all those tables, because they weren't tables with legs on, they were just planks of wood resting on trestles. They would move those out of the way, and then they would simply sleep on mattresses on the floor. Now, at a later date,
a modern day party.
Yeah, modern day party, yeah. Everybody crashes out together.
Yeah.
But in this case, they would have added, I believe, at one end of that, a small antechamber within it, where the Lord and the Lady would have been separated from the rest of the people. But as yet, we've got to get in there when it's safe to do so, and do some more surveys to determine if that was the case.
And that might well have been wood.
And that would certainly have been all wood.
Yeah,
so it'd be very difficult to trace it. But the scimitars are very often clues which give you an indication that there was such an antechamber for the Lord and his lady.
Thank you, Howard, for taking me round Upton. It's been both joyous and joyful. It's been really lovely and very interesting.
Thank you for coming, Tom. And one day I hope that I can bring you back when I've completed my researches and we can have a closer look at Upton Castle, because we've only just touched on many of its secrets. It's a fabulous place, full of history, which is still being revealed.
Brilliant.
I look forward to bringing you back here in the near future.
Thank you, Howard.
Thanks for coming.